recording. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to invite Professor Keith Busby to speak in our series. Keith is known to many of you as the former president of the International Arthurian Society. He's now a member of our center as well. He is Douglas Kelly Professor of Medieval French, but he's emeritus now. He's also fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. He's based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has published extensively on any number of, I suppose, Arthurian texts, starting with his study of Gauvin in Old French literature, his critical edition of Perceval by Chrétien de Troyes, his magisterial book that I have next to me, Codex and Context, the study of Old French verse narrative in manuscript, and so on. And his latest, I suppose, in the time he has, he's turned his attentions to the French in medieval Ireland, and only just published recently his edition of the French works of the Irish Dominican monk Geoffroy de Waterford. So today, however, Keith is speaking from his multilingual interests in the tradition of Arthurian romance. And without further ado, I'll hand over to him. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Raluca. If you could put the PowerPoint up. There we go. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, bonjour, buongiorno, goeiedag, whatever it might be, where you are. Well, the received view among scholars is that the geography of medieval romance is fictitious and fantastic. It does not much matter, for example, whether King Arthur's Caerleon is Caerleon on Usk in Monmouthshire, Wales, or Chester in England, for which the Welsh name is also Caerleon. When places are identifiable, even when separated by oceans and hundreds of miles, they can, in romances, be reached in a day on horseback without crossing water. The geographical and temporal aspects of the romance world, by definition, serve the interests of the narrative and not verisimilitude. Such absolute views on the topography and toponymy, and of onomastics for that matter, of medieval romances have generally gone unquestioned. But I believe that there are cases in which we might pay close attention to the geography of romance as possible indicators of provenance, function, and intended audience. Generally speaking, the centre of the romance world, and of the Arthurian romance world in particular, is the region delimited by Wales, England, southern Scotland, and western France. In other words, the area ruled by the Normans in the aftermath of 1066. As one moves outwards from the centre into liminal parts of the known world, the veneer of civilization and courtliness is tested, shows signs of fatigue and sometimes cracks. The rulers of these outlandish provinces of the romance universe may themselves be possessed of all the praiseworthy virtues of chivalry and courtesy, but their domains, it is often suggested, are sometimes wild and lawless, reflecting less than total control. They are so a necessary part of the wider empire, whether the real Norman one or the fictitious one of romance. The periphery of the medieval narrative world is to some extent defined by genre and subject matter. Arthurian romance, for example, seems to know no southern regions beyond the Terre d'Oc and Sicily, and only the vaguest of eastern ones, this despite concrete knowledge of the Levant acquired through the Crusades. Spain is the terrain of the Chanson de Geste, and Africa its periphery. The exotic East is also known to the epic, of course, and better still to the Crusade cycle of the Roman d'Alexandre. The former tends to reflect the geography of what was known of the Holy Land in the Chronicles, while in the latter, exoticism and marvels characterize the vaguest of Oriental domains. Despite his pagan origins, but because of his status as an ideal hero and ruler, one of the 9 worthies, Alexander comes to be seen as a precursor of the Crusaders in what was to become the terrain for holy wars. Now, this dual presentation of the East is significant insofar as it demonstrates that regions which are becoming known in fact can still be presented in narrative as largely fantastic. This is because they are, in short, the source of the very merveille which form the fabric of narrative. To render them mundane is to stymie storytelling. Now, if this is true of the East in the Matière d'Alexandre, it is even truer of the western periphery of the Arthurian world. The Normans arrived in Ireland in 1169, although it took more than half a century for them to subdue the west of the country. And Galway was not taken by Richard More de Burgh until 1234, for example, and they never achieved control of the whole island. In romance, Ireland remains the mysterious edge of the Western world, despite increasing knowledge of it due to its colonization by the Normans, or as historians will now call them simply, the English. In the narrative corpus of the 12th and 13th centuries, it is part of that western and northwestern periphery also formed by Scotland, the Orkneys and parts of Scandinavia, to which I'll return shortly. More than other parts of the periphery, Ireland is merveilleux and the very source of Arthurian tales. A growing awareness among the authors of 13th century romance of the Celtic sources of the genre leads them to attribute retrospectively an Irish genealogy, often via an Irish grandmother, daughter of an Irish king, to most of the principal male figures of the Arthurian world: Merlin, Lancelot, Galahad, Gawain, Eric, and more besides. The ambivalent nature of the Irish periphery can best be seen in a romance dating from about 1275, Les Merveilles de Rigomère, by an author who names himself simply and very unhelpfully as Jean. Apart from Froissart's anachronistic Meliador, this is the last Arthurian romance written in verse, and also postdates most of the great prose romances. Situated for a large part in Ireland, its position at the beginning of Chantilly Musée Condé, I think it's now Musée du Château, 472, the most extensive collection of French Arthurian verse romances, confirms the Irish source of adventures, including many of its own standard narrative mirabilia in the rest of the manuscript. However, it also shows an unusually detailed and accurate knowledge of Irish geography, taking its hero, Lancelot, variously through Breffni, Meath, Connaught, Thomond, Desmond, and the city of Cork. Particularly striking is a depiction of these various regions, those which are civilized and whose inhabitants are courtly correspond exactly to the parts of Ireland controlled by the colonists, while the wild and lawless places full of savages correspond to areas where the native Irish successfully resisted the colonists. The somewhat earlier romance of Durmar le Gallois from about 1240 shows knowledge of the Irish political system and the city of Limerick. Now, if Ireland was the western periphery of the Arthurian world, Scotland was not its northern limit, nor did it hold the status as the fount of adventures. It's therefore less of a surprise to find a relatively detailed representation of the geography of Galloway in Guillaume Leclerc's Fergus from about 1210, which interweaves local political concerns with standard romance motifs in what is now considered in part a parodic treatment of Chrétien de Troyes Perceval and other texts. Nor were other regions of modern-day Scotland mentioned in romances specified as part of the periphery. Loanwes, Lothian, Muraif, Moray, and Escos, which is thought to designate the northeast of the region northeast of the Firth of Forth. The name Northumberland, Northumberland, refers to an area which also contains some of Scotland. The wild periphery does not even seem to begin beyond the northern tip of Scotland, namely the Orkney and Shetland Islands, which were under Norwegian control for most of the Middle Ages. The name Orkney, however, does not seem to refer usually in Arthurian romance to these northern isles. It is nearly always the kingdom of Lot, father of Gawain, Agravain, Gareth, and Gaheris, who together with their incestuous half-brother Mordred make up often known as the Orkney clan. Insofar as it can be established, Orkney is vaguely north of the border, as the English say, but not so far north that Arthur does not hold court there in Chrétien's Perceval. Even if Lot and his sons are allies of Arthur, their northern provenance nevertheless implies an element of untrustworthiness, uncouthness, and the potential for discord, realized in La Mort le Roi Arthur and in the degradation of the character of Gawain in the prose Tristan, where he becomes an out-and-out murderous villain. The place known as the Lointaines Îles, the distant islands, in Arthurian prose romance is home to the giant Galahad, the son of La Belle Jaillande, who becomes Lancelot's devoted friend. That's Galahad, not his mother, who becomes Lancelot's devoted friend and knight of the Round Table in the prose Lancelot. These islands, along with the Îles de Mer, the islands of the sea, have been identified as the Hebrides, likewise under Norwegian control, but there was little Hebridean about them, although their location on the beginnings of a vague geographical fringe make them the ideal provenance for a mysterious and tragic character such as Galahad. The northern periphery of the Romance world is not some kind of Ultima Thule inhabited by trolls, giant polar bears, and axe-wielding berserkers, but is composed of regions just distant enough to seem ambiguously outlandish from the perspective of the centre. In fact, many of the references to Denmark and the few to Norway occur in the same context as those to Ireland, Scotland, and Orkney. For example, in the first continuation of Chrétien's Perceval, Denmark is one of a series of marches, border areas, along with Wales, Northumberland, and Scotland. In Durmau le Gallois, the hero's mother is a daughter of the King of Denmark, just as the mothers of other heroes are daughters of the kings of Ireland. The association of Denmark with Ireland is quite persistent. In both the Livre d'Artus and the Suite du Merlin, the kings of Denmark and Ireland are brothers. Now, it may be a stretch to see this as a residual memory of the Scandinavian invasion of Ireland. Let me see next. Now, typical of this kind of listing of border areas is this passage from Hugh de Rotland's late 12th century Epomedon, which is not Arthurian, of course. I'll just read the translation. The King of Denmark came, and all those from that region, that's the borderland, such as Norway and Jutland and Orkney and Iceland. They came from Scotland, a distant land, to win esteem. Now, the old French word Dänemark is particularly useful to poets as it rhymes with march, with one of its constituent morphemes. Its distance from the centre is particularly noticeable in Clarisse et Larice, where Larice is imprisoned early on in Denmark. Much of the romance deals with attempts to rescue him from a country which appears to elude his would-be liberators even as they try to approach it. Larice becomes King of Denmark, symbolically integrating the periphery into the centre at the end of the romance. Now, the mentions of Norway and Iceland in the passage quoted above from Epomedon, however, are atypical in one sense, for despite the obvious knowledge of these two countries, they are rarely alluded to, underlining my point that whatever may or may not actually have been known about particular countries or regions in the late 12th and 13th centuries from chronicles or encyclopedic texts does not necessarily affect the way they are presented in fiction. Ireland in Les Merveilles de Rigomer appears to be caught between the reality of the invasion and its reputation as a source of marvels for storytelling. Now, one of the problems with allusions to Iceland is the confusion, sometimes scribal, between Island, Ierland, and the fuzzy variant Eland. But there's no confusion in Wasser's Brut, or the first continuation of the Perceval, where Island actually rhymes with Ierland. In the latter, it's found in another list of Marcher regions, including Norway. Now, if references to Norway are relatively rare, there's one romance in which it figures largely and strangely, and that's the story of Saun de Nancé, a text which, by virtue of its subject matter and generic affiliations, has always been on the periphery of the Arthurian canon. A simple glance at the histories of Arthurian literature, in which it's sometimes present, sometimes absent, or more often than not relegated to a footnote, will confirm its ambiguous status. Until recently, Saun de Nancé was available only in the adequate inadequate, 1899 text of Moritz Goldschmidt, who was apparently not equal to the editing task. Although the romance had been the object of a thorough investigation by Claude Lachey, published in 1989, the latter's long-promised critical edition has only just appeared. It also has the misfortune of being preserved only in a single manuscript. That's Turin, Biblioteca Nazionale Universitaria L113, badly damaged in the famous fire of 1904. The manuscript contains, in order, Héracle by Gauthier d'Arras, Le Blanc Chevalier and Le Chevalier à la Manche by Jean de Condé, both by Jean de Condé, Saône de Nancy, Chrétiens Cligès, and Richard Biaus. The terminus a quo for the manuscript is 1345, the death of Jean de Condé. Now, it could be argued that the notion of periphery played a role in determining the contents of the entire manuscript. Héracle as Emperor of Constantinople, Cligès as Emperor of Greece, Richard as King of Frisia, and Saône as King of Norway. Now, Saône is a verse romance with a short prose prologue and over 21,000 octosyllables, with a lacuna of another 2,400, composed in Brabant, possibly before 1267, although the usual dating is 1270 to 1280. Remco Slederink has recently demonstrated convincingly that it was composed at the court of Brabant itself. Its very origins are therefore linguistically peripheral, in that Brabant is one of the border areas where Dutch and French meet and mingle. The principal literary language of the court of Brabant alternated between the two quite abruptly on occasion, according to marriage alliances and shifts in power. Slederink argues that Saône was written at the behest of Adelaide of Burgundy, as a means of promoting the accession of her son, Jan I, to the position of Duke of Brabant, when his brother, the unfortunate Hendrik IV, stood down. This is the reason for the proposed change of date of composition. The romance shows clear traces of Chrétien de Troyes, including one verbatim quotation, repeated, which I'll talk about shortly, and contains an important passage pertaining to the history of the Grail. But no, specifically Arthurian characters or places play an important role. Saône de Nancy is in many respects a peripheral text that can be seen either as having been drawn into the orbit of Arthurian romance or propelled centrifugally to the outer reaches of the generic galaxy. Saône is usually, and one suspects out of desperation, classified by scholars as a roman d'aventure. Well, what roman isn't? One of the many quirks of Goldschmidt's edition is that it relegated the prose prologue of the romance to an appendix, whereas its proper position is where a prologue should be, as indeed it is in the manuscript. Lachey's edition corrects this strange and entirely unjustifiable intervention. The prologue, supposedly written by one Branc, the clerk of the Dame de Baruch, that's Beirut, and Châtelaine of Cyprus, at the latter's behest, offers an incomplete summary of the romance, but sketches the genealogy of her family from Anciel, Anselm de Brabant, who married Aélis, daughter of Aine of Flandre. You'll have to excuse the genealogy here. From which union issued two sons, Renaud and Henri. The date of Anciel's death is given as 632. Henri marries Idoine, large and perfectly formed daughter of the Duc de Malogne in Germany, and the couple have two sons, small and perfectly formed Henri and Saône. The two boys are orphaned at an unspecified age. Saône falls in love with Ida, daughter of Eudes de Donchéry in the Ardennes, but is persistently spurned by her, despite his repeated displays of prowess. Dejected, he leaves his sick brother and travels to England, Scotland, and Ireland, the queen of which latter bears him a son, Margon, who becomes king of Sicily. Following this? From Ireland, he goes to Norway, where he marries the king's daughter, Ode, with whom he has 3 sons, and accedes to the throne of that country, only later becoming Emperor of Rome. One son, Oudience or Oudurance marries the wicked Matabrune. Their son, Oriance, marries Elouse or Eliox, mother of the 3 swan children, and the rest of the tale is well known. Saun is thus the great-grandfather of the Chevalier or Cygne, the Swan Knight. 2 sons of Saun and Odet become kings of Norway, Audience and Jerusalem. Henri, and the 3rd becomes Pope, Milan. The kingdom of Jerusalem was the father of Fan de Baruch, who requested Branc to write the romance. I'm sorry about that. I should maybe have sent out a handout with the summary on it. But now, supposed patronage of Fan de Baruch links the text to the Crusader kingdoms, to the Lusignan-Ibelin dynasties, perhaps even specifically to Hugh III of Cyprus, who married Isabella d'Ibelin in about 1255, who assumed his mother's name of Lusignan upon the death of his cousin Hugh II in 1267, which coincidentally perhaps, was the very terminus a quo proposed by Sledering for the composition of the romance. Hugh became de facto regent of Jerusalem in 1264 and was crowned king in 1269. Now, this link, I think, deserves further investigation. Well, Lacher identifies most of Saun de Nancy's debts to Chrétien in the course of his study, but there's one I should like to comment on briefly as a first example of the romance's Arthurian marginality. It concerns Chrétien's admonition in Perceval about needless repetition. Qui autrefois le conterait à nuit ses oiseuses serait, que nous contes de ce n'amende. It's always surprised me that Chrétien scholars have not made more of this, this authorial intervention. And in Chrétien, the context is Perceval's recounting to Grandemont his visits to Arthur's court, and the device avoids telling again how Perceval was given the armor of the Chevalier Vermeil. Now, I read this not as just a simple warning about repetition, but also as a barb aimed at other storytellers who do repeat the same narrative over and over. In Saun de Nancy, the passage is first quoted when Geoffroy returns to Norway from the Scottish court with the Scots' response to Alain's message. Qu'autrefois le vous conterait à nuit ses huiseuses serait, car contes ne peut amender d'une cause intracondère. If anyone were to tell you this again, it would be tedious and futile, for a story does not get better when the same thing is told so often. And the second instance occurs during the discussions of Saun's response to the Pope's request for aid. Qu'autrefois le recorderait à nuit ses viseuses serait. If anyone were to tell this again, it would be tedious and futile. Now, in both instances, the barb has gone. The formula has been reduced to a simple occupatio. Now, if the author of Saun de Nancy has made a conscious decision to eschew an Arthurian subject, he's unable or unwilling to break away entirely from the Chrétien tradition and remains sometimes tenuously attached to it. Now, the one aspect of Saun de Nancy that has perhaps prevented it from falling into total obscurity is its exploitation of the Grail theme. The brief history of Joseph of Arimathea, which it includes, incorporates and melds elements from Chrétien's Perceval, the continuations, and the Lancelot Graal. One of the most curious aspects of the Grail treatment in Saun is the displacement of Logre, presented as wasteland, to Norway. Et si vous dit de la contrée, or est Norvège appelée. And I'll tell you about this country. It's now called Norway. Well, the literal and littoral marginalization of the Grail to a Nordic location, curiously named Galoche, nevertheless means that it can be found at will by those who know where it is. Moreover, the holy vessel is simply kept in an ivory casket where it can be extracted by the abbot as part of a veritable Grail performance. In most Grail romances, of course, it appears to the questing knights when they are in a sufficient state of grace to enable them to approach it. In Sone, the Grail is in some ways banalized, and Galoche made part of the kingdom which Sone and his descendants will inherit, simultaneously therefore becoming guardians of the Grail. The merveilleux of traditional Arthurian romance is now only marvellous in the most prosaic sense, namely that it's astonishing and worthy of admiration, rather than incomprehensible and inexplicable. Sone's career in many ways mirrors that of Joseph of Arimathea, and his arrival in and frequent visits to Galoche. They constitute a laying claim to his heritage and a link to the spiritual Grail tradition of both Chrétien's Perceval and the Lancelot Graal. Thus does Sone de Nancy make its eponymous hero a central link between Joseph of Arimathea and the Chevalier au Cygne, the Swan Knight, completing a lineage that stretches from the time of Christ to the court of medieval Brabant. Brabant had essentially adopted the legend of the Chevalier au Cygne as its own when Hendrik I married Mathilde of Bourgogne of Flanders in 1179. Godfrey de Bouillon was henceforth and retrospectively Brabantine. This would clearly have made the inclusion of the rewritten Grail and Joseph of Arimathea legend extremely attractive to Aleida of Burgundy, were she in fact the patroness of the romance. After the Grail service during Sone's third visit to Galoche, the abbot neatly replaces the Grail, the tip of the lance, and part of the true cross in their ivory containers and puts the candelabra back in its rightful place where Joseph had originally positioned it. There then occurs the peculiar episode of the Île Carrée, the square island, to which the abbot accompanies the entire troop for a celebration. The island, according to the narrative, had first been settled and its castles built by the pagan king Tadus, who soon converted to Christianity. And Tadus was the father of Bodmagu and grandfather of Meliagant. And as in Chrétien's Lancelot, Magu is courteous and wise, and his son the worst of all evil men, a traitor who deservedly came to a bad end. Joining the island to a causeway is the sword bridge, Ponce de l'Espée, où haute mainte tieste de Corbeil contre Meliagance en fut sire, the sword bridge where many a head was severed when Meliagant was its lord. Now, an evil custom on the island is attributed to the presence in the cemetery of the malodorous corpse of Joseph of Arimathea's pagan wife, which is unceremoniously dumped in the sea by the valiant sailor Gratien, thereby abolishing said custom. Now, it's clear that structurally the Île Carrée stands in opposition to Galoche, and that it represents, towards the end of the romance, one of the final obstacles to the resolution of its narrative. In practical terms, however, the whole episode once again displaces well-known elements of one of Chrétien's romances to the periphery of a Norwegian fjord. Two other worlds, the wasteland and Gore, have thus been relocated to the margins of the real world. This is possible precisely because Sone de Nancy is not an Arthurian romance proper, despite numerous Arthurian elements in its makeup. Now, it's in any case quite clear that its author was steeped in the vernacular literature of his time, Arthurian and otherwise. One of the minstrel figures, Romanal, for example, when denouncing the boasting of the royal knights during the tournament at Montargis, alludes to the Morholt, Gascuns amort le Morholt, and then to a number of female characters, the identity of two of which remains obscure, and I'd be grateful if anyone could identify them. The first of these references, I think, is reminiscent of Kay's sarcasm at the end of Calogrenant's tale in Chrétien's Yvain. Après manger sans remuer, va chascuns n'aura din tuer, et voici rights vanger forêt. Now, I'm not clear on the identity in the second quotation of Yermontru and Foucault, who figure at it. It's not Michel, presumably, who figure alongside Ersan from Le Roman de Renard and the eponymous heroines of Berthe au Grand-Pied and Aïe d'Avignon. Other aspects of Saône de Nancy might well have contributed to its fluctuating Arthurian marginality in the eyes and ears of an alert medieval reader or listener. During Saône's trials and tribulations in the course of his wooing of Ide, the Countess of Champagne, in the course of his wooing of Ide, the Countess of Champagne calls a tournament at Chalon-sur-Marne, which is now Châlons-en-Champagne in the Marne, of which the prize is a golden sheep, followed by a table ronde at Machaut in the Ardennes. Well, it's not exactly clear what the table ronde consists of, but Lacher, in his commentary on the romance, defines it as, I'll just read the translation here, a sporting contest followed by various festivities. Nightly entertainment consists of a series of individual jousts during which each participant tries to unhorse his opponent using his lance only. Gallant conversations, witty repartee, banquets, song and dance all contribute to the success of a round table as much as the day's duels. Well, the very expression table ronde, of course, evokes Arthurian romance, and the inevitable rhyme ronde and monde goes all the way back to Was. It's also tempting to wonder whether the Countess of Champagne could not be seen as an inscription in the text of Marie de Champagne, the patroness of Chrétien's Lancelot. Finally, there's the question of the heraldry of Saône de Nancy. Now, this may merit further study as a potential means of confirming the provenance of the romance in the court of Brabant, or possible links with the Lusignan-Ibelin dynasties, but it appears to be a characteristic mixture of the realistic and the fictional. In other words, if some of the arms might refer to the blazon of historical figures, others appear to be those of the characters of romance. In the same tournament as Chalon just mentioned, some bear arms argent acanton gules. Those are the arms shown to be the arms of Gauvin by Jerry Bro and Michel Roux, and given to him as such in Durmar Escanor by Gérard Demien, prose Lancelot, the Tristan, the Enfants Augier by Adney Leroy, and a late addition to the second continuation of the Perceval. Now, these texts range in date from the 1220s through the end of the 13th century, and it's therefore quite likely that the audience of Saône de Nancy would have recognized them and concluded that Saône was being presented in some ways as a latter day rewritten Gauvin. It's difficult to know how far to push this in terms of interpreting the romance as a whole. Saône's incognito at the Chalon tournament certainly has echoes of Lancelot's at Noaut's and other episodes in other romances, of course, and his various amorous misadventures with Ide of Donchéry, the widowed Queen of Ireland, and Odet of Norway might have brought to mind Gauvin's reputation as a womanizer. It also raises the unlikely prospect of Gauvin morphed into Saône as a guardian of the Grail. So, from its Brabantine origins on the northern periphery of medieval Francophonia, through the adventures in Ireland, Scotland, Norway, its coverage of imperial, royal and noble domains in these countries, the Mediterranean and the Middle East, to the obscure links with the Lusignan-Ibelin territories in Cyprus and Beirut, Saône de Nancy is a peripheral romance. Its position on the Arthurian fringe is just a part of the overarching marginality which has surely led to its own displacement to the distant realms of the academic footnote. So I'll conclude now with a few words about Sweden. A search of the editions of every published Old French romance produces only one clear reference to the country, and that to a particular region. To this, we might add several references to Gotland, assuming that this may be Götaland and not Jylland, Jutland in Denmark. It is, however, a very interesting reference and one which raises and answers an important question. The text is the Anglo-Norman prose romance of Fulke le Fitzwarren, preserved in a single manuscript, British Library, Royal 20C12, copied and assembled in or around Ludlow, Shropshire, between 1325 and 1340 by a scribe also responsible for the much better known Harley 2253 and parts of Harley 273. The prose Fulke is the reworking of a lost verse original from the second half of the preceding century, and some of the original verse text actually are embedded in the prose and can be reconstructed. Fulke le Fitzwarren is a generic hybrid, a cross between what's usually called an ancestral romance, in that it relates the history of several generations of the Fitzwarren family in the Welsh Marches, and an outlaw narrative, because Fulke is a good outlaw, an enemy of wicked King John. It combines historical fact and romance fiction. Now here's the passage. Sorry about the layout on here, but I think we can manage. I'll just, so in one of the extravagant passages, Fulke reaches Orkney and returns to its king, a daughter who had been earlier abducted by the 7 sons of a wicked old woman. And I'll read the translation here. Fulke sailed so long to witness marvels and adventures that he circumnavigated the 7 isles of the ocean, Little Britain, Ireland, Jutland, Norway, Denmark, Orkney, Great Scania. In Scania there lives no man, only serpents or dragons and other hideous beasts. There Fulke saw horned serpents whose horns were extremely sharp, and who had 4 feet and flew like birds. One serpent attacked Fulke, struck him with his horn and pierced his shield. Fulke marveled at the blow and realized that when the serpent struck his shield, it could not quickly free its horn. So Fulke pushed his sword into its heart. There Fulke saw a poisonous worm which had a mastiff's head, a beard and feet like a goat, ears like a hare, and several other beasts which St. Patrick chased out of Ireland and corralled them there by the power of God, for the worthy St. Patrick was in his good graces, and no poisonous beast yet lives in the land of Ireland, except tailless lizards, which is actually correct. Fulke went sailing north across the great ocean beyond Orkney, and he encountered so much cold and ice that a man could not endure the cold, nor could the ship go further on account of the ice. Fulke turned back towards England. Well, Scania, and La Grande Scania Magna perhaps, must refer to Skåne, the southernmost tip of modern-day Sweden. It was known to the Romans as Scania, and of course as the Scan in Scandinavia. It was part of the Kingdom of Denmark until the middle of the 17th century. The editors of the romance gloss Scania simply as Sweden, but without saying why. Why the author of Fulke le Fitzwarren singles it out is quite unclear, and why he chooses it as the refuge of St. Patrick's snakes is equally obscure. As far as I can tell, this is the only explanation of what happened to the snakes when Patrick expelled them from the Emerald Isle, even though the belief in the expulsion of the snakes is itself an ancient one. In any case, Scania is clearly not fit for human habitation and is on the edge of the known world. Beyond it lies only cold and ice. So Fulke does what any self-respecting Englishman would do in the circumstances. He goes home to England. Generally speaking, then, we should not expect to find topographical or geographic realism in Old French romance, Arthurian and non-Arthurian. But within the world of romance itself, the periphery, including the Scandinavian periphery, has a consistent place and function. Distant, but for the most part attainable after a struggle, uncouth but susceptible in varying degrees to the civilizing influences of the centre, the romance periphery sustains itself in what is essentially a parallel universe. By the time most of the romances discussed here were written, knowledge of Ireland, the northernmost parts of the British Isles, Scandinavia and Iceland was accessible through chronicles and encyclopedic texts, and of course the travels of merchants and diplomats. In spite of this, the romance periphery had to remain what and where it had always been, somewhere out there. Thank you.